For 30 years, one desk and one couch decided who got to be famous in America. If Johnny Carson liked you, your career could change overnight. If he didn't, or if you crossed him, you could vanish from network television as if you'd never been there at all. Most guests understood the unspoken rule: respect the king, and the king will make you a star. One woman broke that rule. She wasn't a wild comedian setting furniture on fire or a shock jock bringing strippers on set. She was, for years, one of the people Johnny Carson trusted the most. And when she made one decision without telling him first, he shut the door on her so completely that it stayed shut for almost 3 decades, long after he was gone. This is the story of Joan Rivers, the woman Johnny Carson helped create, and the betrayal, real or perceived, that ended their relationship forever. Long before she was a red carpet fixture with a rapier tongue, Joan Rivers was a struggling comedian bouncing between small clubs, industrial films, and rejection after rejection. She had already tried acting under a stage name, failed, gone back to secretarial work, and returned to comedy out of sheer stubbornness. By the early 1960s, she was grinding through the same dingy Greenwich Village rooms as a generation of comics who would go on to define American humor. Her first appearance on The Tonight Show came in 1965. She was nervous and proven, and one bad set away from being written off as another comic who couldn't translate club material to national television. But something clicked. Carson, who prided himself on being a shrewd judge of comedic timing, saw a rawness in Rivers that reminded him of his own instincts. At the end of that set, according to numerous retellings from people close to the show, Carson turned to her on air and told her she was going to be a star. It wasn't just a kind thing to say. On The Tonight Show, a compliment from Johnny Carson functioned like a public certification. Bookers, network executives, and club owners all watched the show, and Carson's approval meant something concrete: better rooms, better pay, better scripts sent her way. Overnight, Rivers went from an anonymous comic to a name people in the industry were talking about. Over the following years, she became one of the show's most reliable and beloved guests. Her comedy was different from most of what aired on network television at the time: self-deprecating, fast, unapologetically female, willing to talk about marriage, aging, body image, and status anxiety in ways that mainstream television usually avoided. Carson liked that she pushed boundaries without ever losing control of a joke, and audiences responded to her the same way they responded to him. She felt unpredictable, but never accidental. By the late 1970s, Rivers wasn't just a guest. She had become a fixture. She hosted segments, filled in when Carson was away, and built a rapport with him that read as genuine warmth rather than professional courtesy. In 1983, that relationship was formalized. NBC named Joan Rivers the permanent guest host of The Tonight Show, a role that made her, in practical terms, the second most powerful person connected to the franchise. When Carson took a night off, audiences knew Rivers would be behind the desk, delivering monologues in the same time slot, to the same audience, under the same NBC umbrella that had built Carson's empire in the first place. For 3 years, that arrangement worked. Rivers used the guest host role to sharpen her own voice, build her own following, and prove she could do more than tell jokes about herself. She could run a show. Insiders at NBC reportedly saw her as the heir apparent, the person best positioned to eventually take over hosting duties whenever Carson decided to retire. Rivers herself, by her own later accounts, believed she had an unspoken understanding with Carson, that when the time came for him to step back, she would be considered. That assumption would turn out to be the most expensive miscalculation of her career. By the mid-1980s, the television landscape was changing in a way that threatened NBC's decades-long grip on late night. The Fox Broadcasting Company, then a scrappy fourth network trying to establish itself as a real competitor, was looking for a signature program that could go head-to-head with The Tonight Show. Fox executives zeroed in on Rivers. She had the name recognition, the built-in audience from her Tonight Show guest hosting run, and, crucially, the ambition to want her own show rather than permanently being an understudy. Fox offered her exactly that: The Late Show starring Joan Rivers, her own program, her own name in the title, her own control over the format. For a comedian who had spent 2 decades being underestimated, It was an almost irresistible proposition. It would make her the first woman to host a late-night network talk show in the United States, a historic milestone that no amount of loyalty to an existing arrangement could easily outweigh. There was only one problem, and it was not a small one. Rivers signed the deal without telling Johnny Carson first. Accounts differ slightly on the exact sequence of events, but the consensus among people who worked at NBC at the time is consistent on the essential point. Carson did not hear about the Fox deal from Rivers. He heard about it from someone else, possibly a network executive or through industry gossip, before Rivers ever picked up the phone to tell him herself. In an industry built on relationships, timing, and the appearance of loyalty, that omission was the entire scandal. It didn't matter that Rivers had spent years being generous to Carson on air, or that she likely had legitimate business reasons for the secrecy. Network deals of that magnitude are often negotiated under strict confidentiality clauses long before any public announcement. What mattered to Carson was optics. The woman he had elevated from unknown comic to national guest host was leaving to compete directly against him, and he had to learn about it like everyone else. By the time Rivers finally called Carson to tell him herself, the news had already reached him. The call, by most accounts, was short, tense, and unsatisfying for both parties. Rivers later said she tried to explain her side, but Carson had already made up his mind about what her silence meant. Carson did not respond with a public statement or a carefully worded segment addressing the split. He did something far more effective for a man in his position. He simply erased her. Rivers was removed from The Tonight Show's roster entirely. She was not invited back as a guest. She was not mentioned. As far as the show's programming was concerned, one of its most successful guest hosts in history had simply stopped existing. Worse, the fallout extended beyond Rivers herself. Word spread that anyone who appeared on her new Fox program risked damaging their standing with Carson's booking team. In an era where The Tonight Show still functioned as the single most valuable stage in American comedy, that kind of informal blacklist carried real weight. Performers who might otherwise have jumped at the chance to support a groundbreaking new show had to think twice about whether doing so would cost them access to the more established, more powerful program. The professional damage to Rivers was significant, but by her own later admission, it was the personal rupture that hurt more. She had, in interviews over the following years, described Carson less like a colleague and more like family, the person who discovered her, championed her, and gave her a career when almost no one else would. Losing the show was one thing. Losing the relationship entirely, with no path back, was another, and it really was permanent. Rivers reportedly reached out more than once in the years that followed, hoping to smooth things over, at minimum on a personal level even if the professional relationship couldn't be salvaged. According to multiple accounts from people close to both of them, Carson never responded. He did not take her calls. He did not send word through intermediaries. The silence lasted the rest of his life. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers itself did not last long. Behind-the-scenes tension with Fox executives, disagreements over creative control, and disappointing ratings led to Rivers's departure from her own program within roughly a year of its launch. A brutal irony, given that the opportunity had cost her one of the most important relationships of her career. The show's failure only deepened the sense, fair or not, that she had burned a 2-decade bridge for something that didn't pan out the way she had hoped. The years immediately following the Fox show's cancellation were among the hardest of Rivers's life. Her husband, Edgar Rosenberg, who had also served as her manager and had been deeply involved in the negotiations for the Fox deal, struggled with depression in the aftermath of the show's collapse. In 1987, Rosenberg died by suicide. Rivers was left not only professionally exiled from the industry that had made her famous, but personally devastated, grieving a partner of over 20 years while publicly carrying the label of the woman who had betrayed Johnny Carson. She has spoken candidly in later interviews about how isolating that period was, losing her show, losing her standing with NBC, and losing her husband within a relatively short span of time, all while much of the industry treated her as something close to radioactive. Rebuilding from that low point took years, and it required Rivers to essentially start over in a business that had, until recently, considered her one of its rising leaders. To her credit, she did rebuild. Rivers found new footing in a genre she would eventually help define: red carpet and award show commentary. Her direct, often merciless style of interviewing and critiquing fashion on the red carpet became appointment viewing in the 1990s and 2000s, giving her a second act that, in some ways, made her even more culturally relevant to a younger generation than her stand-up career had. She also built a substantial career in fashion retail, hosting successful shopping segments and building a business empire around her name. Later, she found a new comedic partnership with her daughter Melissa on programs examining celebrity fashion, and continued performing stand-up well into her 70s, famous for material that grew sharper, not softer, with age. But no amount of success in other arenas changed the fact that The Tonight Show remained close to her for as long as Johnny Carson was alive, and, remarkably, for years after he retired as well, since the informal band outlasted his tenure and carried into the successor era of the show under new hosts who were reportedly reluctant to reverse a decision so closely associated with Carson's legacy. What makes this story different from a typical show business falling out is its sheer duration. Feuds in entertainment are common, but they usually cool off. Careers intersect again at award shows, mutual friends broker reconciliations, or simple professional necessity forces two people back into a room together. None of that happened here. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, handing the desk to Jay Leno. Rivers still was not invited back. Carson lived for another 13 years after retirement, largely out of the public eye, granting almost no interviews and rarely appearing on television at all. He died in 2005 from complications related to respiratory illness. By every account from people who knew them both, he and Rivers never spoke again after that initial phone call in 1986. Not a reconciliation dinner. Not a handwritten note. Not even a brief exchange at one of the industry events they would occasionally both attend from a distance. 19 years of silence, ending only with his death. Rivers, for her part, never stopped acknowledging what Carson had meant to her career, even while carrying the weight of his rejection. In interviews across the decades that followed, she spoke about him with a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief, grateful for the opportunity he'd given a struggling comic in 1965 and openly pained that the same man could not find it in himself to forgive her or even speak to her for the rest of his life. The ban on Rivers herself technically outlived Carson by years. It wasn't lifted by Jay Leno, who hosted the program for the better part of 2 decades after Carson's departure. It took a full generational change at the network, the arrival of Jimmy Fallon as host in 2014, before Rivers was formally welcomed back onto The Tonight Show stage. By then, nearly 30 years had passed since she'd stood behind that desk as guest host. Fallon's decision to bring her back was treated as a genuinely historic moment in late-night television, a symbolic closing of one of the industry's longest-running grudges. Rivers appeared warm, characteristically funny, and visibly moved by the return, joking about the absurd length of her exile even as she clearly understood its emotional weight. She died the following year, in 2014, meaning her return to The Tonight Show came in almost the final chapter of her life, a reconciliation with the show, if not with the man who had shut her out of it. It's tempting to reduce this story to a simple morality tale. Don't betray a powerful man, or you'll pay for it forever. But the more interesting truth is what it reveals about how fragile even the strongest relationships in show business could be, and how much power was concentrated in the hands of a single host during television's most dominant era. Johnny Carson didn't need lawyers, contracts, or public statements to end someone's career trajectory. His approval or disapproval functioned as its own institution. When he decided Joan Rivers was no longer welcome, that decision rippled through the entire industry without him ever having to explain himself. That kind of unilateral power is almost unimaginable in today's fragmented media landscape, where no single show or host controls access to an entire industry the way The Tonight Show once did. At the same time, the story